let's get right into it. Number 10. The San Pedro Mummy. So picture this. It's 1932, and these two gold miners are blasting away at some rocks in Wyoming, hoping to strike it rich. Instead of gold, they find something weird. Hidden in a small cave sitting on a ledge was a tiny mummy. And when I say tiny, I mean tiny. This thing was only 6 inches tall. That's about the size of a smartphone. The miners named it Pedro, and people went nuts trying to figure out what it was. Some thought it was proof of a legendary race of tiny people that Native Americans used to talk about. Others said it was an alien. But when scientists finally got their hands on it, they found out it was actually a baby. A very unfortunate baby born with a rare condition that made its head look like a tiny adult's head. The mummy became quite famous. It went from being displayed in a drugstore window to being bought by a car dealer. But then, in the 1950s, it just disappeared. Nobody knows where it is today. Number 9. The Frankenstein Mummies. Back in 2001, some scientists were digging around in Scotland when they found something really messed up. They found what looked like normal mummies from 3,000 years ago, but when they took a closer look, they realized something was very wrong. Someone had taken parts from different bodies and put them together to make new ones. We're talking about a head from one person, arms from another, legs from someone else. And get this, some of the body parts were hundreds of years older than others. Basically, someone in ancient Scotland was playing Dr. Frankenstein, but with mummies. Now, you might be wondering, why would anyone do this? Well, that's the thing. We don't really know. Maybe it was some kind of ritual. Maybe they were trying to honor their ancestors. Or maybe they just got really bored one day. What makes this even weirder is that this is the only place in the world where we've found mummies like this. It's not like this was a common thing people did back then. Number 8. The Pit of Death. In 2012, some construction workers in France were just doing their job, digging around for a new building project. But then they found something that probably made them wish they'd called in sick that day. They uncovered this deep pit, about as tall as a grown man, filled with human bones. And we're not talking about a normal ancient burial site. This was way more messed up. At the bottom of the pit, they found 7 complete bodies. One of them was this middle-aged dude who had his arm chopped off and his head bashed in. Above these bodies were more severed arms, including one from a teenager. There were also fingers scattered everywhere, and the remains of babies and kids. Scientists dated this gruesome discovery to about 5,335 years ago. That's way back in the Stone Age. Researchers think these people were probably victims of ancient warfare. Some might have been executed as punishment for crimes. Number 7. The Great Atari Dump. Back in 2014, they found something really weird buried in the New Mexico desert, a massive pile of Atari video games. Now, you might be thinking, who buries video games in the desert? Well, it was Atari themselves. See, back in the 80s, Atari was rushing to make an E.T. video game to cash in on the movie's success. But they messed up big time. The game was so bad that nobody wanted to buy it. So what did Atari do with all these games nobody wanted? They drove them out to the middle of nowhere and buried them. We're talking thousands of game cartridges, just dumped in the desert and covered with concrete. For years, people thought this was just an urban legend. But then in 2014, they actually found it. A documentary crew went out there and started digging. And sure enough, there they were. Thousands of E.T. games, along with other Atari stuff, all perfectly preserved under the desert sand. The weird part is that some of these buried games are now worth thousands of dollars. Number 6. The Neanderthal Flute. So, it's 1995, and some archaeologists are digging around in this remote cave in Slovenia called Divje Babe. They're just doing their thing, brushing away dirt, when they find something weird. A bear's thigh bone that's about 60,000 years old. At first, they thought it might just be some random bone that animals had chewed on, but when they looked closer, they realized these holes were too perfect to be bite marks. They were drilled with precision, exactly where they needed to be to make different musical notes, just like a modern flute. Here's where it gets crazy. It was made by Neanderthals. You know those guys everyone thought were just dumb cavemen? Well, turns out they were making music before we even showed up. Now, some scientists argue about whether it's actually a flute. Some say it could just be a bone that got holes in it naturally. But come on. What are the chances that random holes would line up perfectly to make musical notes? Number 5. The Whale Graveyard in the Desert. Imagine you're working on a highway in Chile's Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth. You're digging away, probably thinking about lunch, when suddenly, you hit something big, like whale-sized big. Because that's exactly what happened in 2010. Construction workers found not just one whale skeleton, but dozens of them. We're talking about over 40 whales, just chilling in the middle of the desert, 40 miles or about 65 kilometers away from the ocean, and about 120 feet above sea level. They were perfectly preserved fossils from 6 to 9 million years ago. They also found seals and even this weird extinct dolphin that had tusks. So how did all these sea creatures end up in one of the driest places on Earth? Scientists think it might have been because of toxic algae. Basically, these whales and other animals probably ate some bad sushi, died in the ocean, and washed up on what used to be a beach. Then, over millions of years, the land rose up, turning that ancient beach into a desert. Number 4. The Giant Antarctic Egg. Back in 2011, some Chilean scientists were hanging out in Antarctica when they stumbled upon something weird. It was this massive egg, about the size of a football. They called it the Thing, because they had no idea what it was. For almost 10 years, this egg was just sitting there in a museum, confusing everyone who looked at it. It was too big to be a dinosaur egg, and too old to be from any modern animal. Finally, in 2020, some scientists figured it out. This thing was laid by a mosasaur. Imagine a giant swimming lizard, like a T-Rex mixed with a shark. Now here's where it gets really weird. We always thought these marine reptiles gave birth to live babies, like whales do, but this egg suggests they might have been crawling up onto beaches to lay eggs, like sea turtles. Also, Antarctica wasn't always a frozen wasteland. Back when this egg was laid about 68 million years ago, it was more like Florida. Warm, sunny, and full of life. Number 3. Tunisian desert lake. Picture this. You're living in Tunisia, in the middle of a desert. It's hot as hell. There's a drought going on, and everyone's struggling to find water. Then one morning in 2014, people wake up and find a lake. Yeah, you heard that right. A whole lake just appeared overnight in the middle of the desert. This thing was about the size of a football field and deep enough to swim in. At first, the water was crystal clear and blue, like something out of a movie, but after a few days, the water started turning green. Scientists showed up and were like, guys, maybe don't swim in the mysterious desert lake that appeared out of nowhere. They said the water might be radioactive or it may cause cancer. But people were so desperate to cool off from the heat, they jumped in anyway. I mean, when it's that hot and you've got a lake in your backyard, are you really going to listen to some scientist telling you not to swim? To this day, no one knows exactly how this lake appeared. Some think it was underground water that found its way to the surface. Others think it might have been something more mysterious. Number 2. The giant ball of Bosnia. Picture this. You're walking through a forest in Bosnia, minding your own business, when suddenly you stumble upon a massive stone ball just sitting there. We're talking about a perfectly round stone sphere that's about 10 feet wide. It weighs somewhere between 30 to 60 tons. It was discovered by this archaeologist named Samir Osmanagic. People call him the Bosnian Indiana Jones because he's always finding weird stuff. Now, Samir thinks this sphere was made by some ancient civilization that was super advanced. He believes they had technology we can't even imagine, and they used it to make this perfect sphere over 1,500 years ago. But most scientists disagree with him. They say it's just a natural formation. Apparently, sometimes nature just decides to make perfect spheres out of rock. It's called a concretion, which is just a fancy way of saying rocks that grew together into a ball shape. Number 1. The underground city. In 1963, a guy in Turkey was doing some home renovations. He knocked down a wall and found something weird behind it, a hidden room. But this wasn't just any room. It was the entrance to a massive underground city. This place was huge. We're talking about a city that goes down 200 feet underground. That's like a 20-story building, but underground. And it could fit 20,000 people. This place had everything. Living rooms, kitchens, wineries, stables, schools, and even churches. They even had a ventilation system to make sure people could breathe down there. But here's where it gets really interesting. They found these massive stone doors throughout the city. These doors could be rolled into place to block off different sections if they were under attack. And they could only be opened from the inside. Pretty smart, right? Scientists think this place might be over 2,800 years old. It was probably built as a hiding spot from invading armies. People could live down there for months without ever having to come up to the surface. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.